Okay, this is our witness. This is. Sorry, I'm sorry. I like messed up. I'm sorry.
I can cut it out.
Okay. This is our Witness to War, Serving a Nation project with Nauset Regional High School with Mr. Fellows. Okay, so how did you end up on Cape Cod?
We retired on Cape Cod after being in the military for 30 years. We had moved around the United States and looked forward to settling down in a familiar place, and we'd always come to Cape Cod as children.
Oh, that's nice. How did you end up in the military?
This was during college. I was draft number 4 during the first draft lottery, and that meant that I was going to be going into the Army. And that's what got me in on the first time.
What made you want to join the military?
Actually, I didn't want to join the military. I was drafted. It wasn't a choice. You had to go in.
How did it feel to be drafted?
Well, once again, as I mentioned earlier, you felt like you had no control over your life. Suddenly you had to move where they told you to move, do what they told you to do, and I ended up being fortunate in that during the process I was offered a commission, that is, commissioned to be an officer, and I accepted that, so it made it a little bit easier than the usual route if someone were drafted.
What does that mean to be a commissioned officer?
Well, the way the military works is it's like a hierarchy, and it's like a pyramid. And at the very, very top are the generals, and then below the generals are the colonels, and the lieutenant colonels, majors, captains, and lieutenants. And those are the officers, and they lead the men. Below that are what we call the enlisted personnel, and they are the privates, the corporals, the sergeants, and there are some other ranks, but those are the most commonly known ranks.
Describe how it felt to return home after war.
Well, I was never actually at war. I was deployed to Haiti during the combat there, but by the time I got in and settled down, peace was declared. So I never was actually at war in the entire 30 years I was in the Army.
What was the scariest moment that you've had?
Well, again, I was fortunate in that I was never in active combat, but I think the most unnerving point was when I left Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we were flying into Haiti, and we thought that there was combat going on, and so we had to land in an airfield that was surrounded by possible combatants, but fortunately by the time we got there, there was no war going on, so I was fortunate not to have that. But I was nervous going in. And so.
How did your parents react to you being
deployed?
Yeah, deployed.
Well, I think, again, I think it was felt that was part of my civic duty. And not just my parents, but I think my whole family felt that they understood why I was in the military, and I think they were proud that I was in the military. So I think they were justifiably nervous, because just traveling around as much as you do in all the airplanes and the different vehicles you use in the military, it's dangerous. The training is dangerous, but I think they were very proud.
At what age did you join the military?
Again, I was drafted at age 22, right out of college.
What college did you go to?
University of Connecticut.
What were some lasting effects of you being in the war, kind of?
Well, once again, not having been in combat, I had probably different experiences than those that were combatants. But I think the common feeling is that you were part of a group, that you depended on one another, and you developed a fondness, trust, and appreciation for these people like nobody else you'd ever have in the rest of your life. I'm not talking about husbands and wives, I mean just friends. It's just a special bond that occurs because you're dependent on one another. You're sharing the same experience and the same anxieties.
Describe a day in being in the military.
Well, again, I was fortunate in that I was a physician. And so a typical day, I would go in and we would have sick call, that is, people that were non-medical people would come in and they would tell us what's wrong with them. And they could be anything from a cold to backaches to appendicitis to whatever. And then we would go on with what our regular job was. My military occupational specialty was in radiology, neuroradiology. And so what I would do is CTs and MRIs of all the soldiers and their dependents. And by dependents, we mean their spouses and their children.
How was it like being a physician there?
It was great because, once again, you basically had healthy people. Some of them were injured, some of them were shot, in combat. But by and large, they were healthy, except for that one event. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so when they came into the hospital, if they were shot, they were in better physical health, and they could do better with that. And when I started, it was the end of Vietnam. We'd see an awful lot of burns. We'd see an awful lot of what we call MFW, multiple fragment wounds, where grenades would go off and lots of little pieces of metal would go through their body. And so we would take care of them. And they were, without a doubt, the best patients I ever treated in my life.
How did you, end up, describe a typical, food you ate there.
Oh. Well, once again, being in the medical department, we generally were in a fairly controlled environment. So like when we were deployed in Haiti, we had tents, we had these metal buildings that we were in that we put our equipment in, and so we had pretty good cafeteria food. Sometimes we'd have to go out in what they call bivouac, and then you eat MREs, which are rations that you take, and you have to eat them out of little plastic bags, and but they weren't that bad, so.
Describe the struggles that you faced adjusting to normal life when you returned.
Well, I don't think I had any struggles whatsoever because I was fortunate not to be put in one of those incredibly difficult situations that you come into during combat. I treated a lot of those patients, and they struggled mightily with those things. It's very hard to live in the first world environment that we live in and then go to this very primitive kind of an arrangement where your housing is bad, your food is bad, and you're doing bad things to people. You know what I mean? Justifiably, but it's still you're doing bad things. And that's hard to get used to. And so these people come back and they really struggle with that.
What was it like being a physician for them?
Well, I think it was a real privilege. It was, the way the Army works is we have basic values that we all subscribe to. For example, loyalty, integrity, service above self, and it goes on and on. There are about 8 of them. And so you're with a group of like-minded people, and you, as I said earlier, you learn to trust them like you trust nobody else in the rest of your life. It was a real privilege.
Before you became a physician there, were you already into being a doctor at college? Or?
No. When I was drafted, I was actually a physical therapist. And so that's when I did most of my care of burn patients and the amputees. I was at Walter Reed. I had to teach them how to walk afterwards. We had to actually debride the burns, that is, to take the dead tissue off of the surface of their body and allow the healing tissue to come up. Then they sent me to graduate school twice, and then they sent me to medical school, internship, residency, and fellowship, and then I became a physician.
Describe the happiest moment that you've had.
Ooh, yeah, there's so many to choose from. But I think one of the proudest moments was when I was retiring and looking back at spending 30 years in this organization. And one of the tokens that they did was, and they typically do, is when you retire, they take the flag that's flying over the post and they bring it down and they give it to you, as a memento. Well, what they did was they took the flag down about a month before I retired, and they flew it to Hawaii, where I trained, and they put it up on that flagpole, and they brought it back down, and then they sent it back to, I was at West Point at the time, and they gave it to me as a retirement gift. So it flew over the post where I retired from and the post where I trained, and that was a real special moment.
Oh, that's amazing. Have you gone back to Hawaii?
Oh yeah,
that's
multiple
so good.
times. Yeah.
How has your life changed since you have retired?
Well, I think the idea is that now suddenly you're with a group of people that don't really understand and don't really appreciate the military. I'm not upset with that. It's just you can't appreciate something you don't know anything about. And so many people don't know something about it. When I was growing up and facing the draft, almost every family had people that either were in the military or had been in the military. But now, when I was chairman of a department at the University of Connecticut after I retired from the military, there was only one other person out of 150 people that had been in the military. Only one other person. So I think it's a completely different experience now. I think many people feel a debt to the military, but I don't think they really understand it. And I think they say, well, thank you for your service, and then they just move on. And they don't really know what the people have done. There are young men and women who have sacrificed so much that I think it would be hard for most people to appreciate.
Mm-hmm. Who was in charge when you were in a position? Who was like...
We have each branch of the military, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, has a Surgeon General. Okay, so it's not just a public health Surgeon General that you hear about all the time on TV. And the Surgeon General for the Army was a 3-star general, is a 3-star general, and I worked underneath him. So he was in charge of the medical department.
When you were drafted, did you know anybody that was drafted with you?
Oh, yeah, a lot of people. That was the common theme. With the draft lottery, what happened is they, of course, put in 366 dates, one for leap year, and they drew those, but they only drafted up to 150, so the first 150. And so if you were 151 all the way above, you didn't get drafted. But if you were 150 or below, most of them were drafted.
What does friendship mean to you now?
That's a good question. I think it means very much what it meant when I was younger, but with greater depth. When you see people that are willing to commit so much for a common goal. So I think I'm very fortunate in that, and my wife and I are fortunate in that we've met people every place we've been that we treasure deeply, and we still stay in touch with them. They're scattered all over the country, from Hawaii to Washington State to Florida to Maine, all over the place, and so they're precious to us.
How many places have you moved due to being drafted?
Well, again, after retirement, this is our 15th move total, so of those, probably 12 were while I was in the military.
Describe your most thrilling experience.
Well, I think the most thrilling experience for me was getting the training that I got. That they sent me to graduate school twice for a master's degree and a PhD, but then they also sent me to medical school. Once I finished that, they did internship and residency, and then I did well, so they sent me to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore for a fellowship, and then I was working in Army hospitals. But I think the training I got was unbelievable.
If a relative of yours is going into the military, what advice would you give them?
Well, that's a tough one, because we have so many people deployed right now. And my daughter married a West Point graduate, and they were in the military for a while. He was in Iraq for 15 months, and then he was in Afghanistan for 12 months after that. And I would just say that I think it's an honorable thing to do, but it's a very high price that you pay. It's hard to have a family that way when you're being deployed and sent overseas that often. So in their first 4 years of marriage, he was gone 2.5 years. And that's very hard for a family, I think. I think we need people to do it, but I think you need to be aware of what you're doing. Otherwise, the family breaks apart, divorce rate can be high, or you're dissatisfied with your military career. So I think you have to go in with your eyes wide open.
What places did you go to?
Well, I started off in San Antonio, Texas. Then I went to Washington, D.C. Then I went to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Then after that, they sent me to school in Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State University. Then after that, I went to Fort Sam Houston, Texas. From Fort Sam Houston, Texas, they sent me to school again up in the Boston area. And from Boston, they sent me to Hawaii. From Hawaii, they sent me to Baltimore. And then from Baltimore, they sent me to Washington, D.C. And from Washington, D.C., my final duty station was at West Point, New York.
What did it feel like to be moving that much?
It's exhilarating. I loved it. It was hard for everybody. It's hard for the family. But it was so much fun. In fact, after I got out of the military, in about 3 years, I got sort of this itch. I wanted to move, to go and meet new people, see new places to live, have new experiences. My children, I think, didn't particularly like it when we were moving, but every one of them, and I have 4, have said what a great childhood it was. They learned so many things, they met so many friends, and again, they have friends all over the country, and so.
Have you ever visited any places that you were at in
Oh
travel?
yes, many of them. I've been back to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I've been to Washington, D.C. multiple times, San Antonio multiple times, but mostly, and back to West Point, New York, but most frequently I think we've gone back to Hawaii because that was our favorite.
What was it like being moving around so much? Like, how did it affect everybody around you?
Well, it was nice in that the nuclear family, that is the mom, the dad, and the kids, had to be very tight, because that's all you had. It was difficult in that you were away from your extended family. Little things that may not seem important, birthday parties, Christmases, Thanksgivings, those kind of things you were away from, and that's hard. It's part of what life is remembering those wonderful holidays together. But when you were in the military, your friends became your surrogate family. And even my daughter says to this day, she says, because she couldn't make it back here for Thanksgiving, so they went to a ranch in Texas. And she said, it was just like growing up. Just we were with good friends. So that was nice.
Did you like being in the physician area, or did you sometimes get bored of it?
Never. I loved it. It was challenging every day. Not only the patients that you had, the medical problems you had to solve, but one of the nice things in the military is, in addition to being a physician, you're also an officer, which means you're a leader. And so, I would be in charge of 40 or 50 people, and having to make it work. You had to make sure that they were what we call fit to fight, that they maintained their physical fitness. You had to make sure they were taken care of from a socioeconomic standpoint. That is, they were doing okay. They ate well, they slept well, they had a good place to live, and you took care of them. They were your unit, and so you had unit integrity. Yeah.
When being a physician in the war, was it like a doctor now, or no?
Yeah, it's almost exactly like it. The clothes are different, but the equipment is very similar. We have it, what we call hardened. So you could take one of the computers I had, and you could actually throw it across the room, and it could land on the ground, and it would do fine. So there were little differences. Made them a little clunkier, not as smooth, and but some of the best equipment is developed for the military. In fact, one of my jobs when I was consultant to the Surgeon General was developing equipment that we could take to combat. So I had to not only have the equipment, but also how do we transport it, and we would make sure that we could do that. So the equipment was great. Overall, though, I would say the big difference is that everybody's younger. The doctors are younger, the patients are younger, and meaning younger adults, not pediatrics. But and you get responsibility at a much earlier age in the military, and you're weeded out on whether you can accept that responsibility, and if so, you're retained and promoted, and if not, you don't.
Did you ever become friends with any of your patients?
Oh yeah, it's hard not to. Again, because oftentimes they were community members. We would live on post, and the post was relatively small, and you got to know all your friends and neighbors, and you were the doc, and this other guy was over here, and he was doing some other job, and sometimes they'd call you and ask you medical questions, and they were your neighbors, so we definitely were friends.
What is your current job now?
I just retired. After the military, again, I was a physician. I was at the University of Massachusetts, and then I went to the University of Connecticut for 10 years, where I was chairman of radiology, and so I led that group of people. And then after that, I retired up here working 2 days a week up at UMass, where I was a professor in the medical school. And then just a couple of months ago, I retired completely.
When you were a physician, were you guys in like a hospital, or were you in something else?
Most of the time we were in hospitals. Sometimes we had to go to what we called portable or mobile hospitals. And depending on the size of the unit, we would have a different configuration. But that was infrequent. Most of the time we were in actual community hospitals, about the size of Cape Cod Hospital in Hyannis, or a little bit smaller. But some were huge medical centers with 750 beds, like Walter Reed. So.
What was it like when you first went in as a physician? Like, what was like your first day like?
Well, remember, I went into the Army first and I wasn't a physician. So when I first went in, I think what strikes you is everything is different. You're not used to having to wear specific clothing. You're not used to people checking to see if your shoes are shined, or can you walk a certain way, do you salute right? There's a whole vocabulary that we're not used to. And you have to get your hair cut, and once you do it for 30 years, you keep it short, and it's just the way it is, And so I think it was a little bit overwhelming in that everything seemed different. The food was different, how you ate was different, who you ate with was different, the words you used were different. But then very quickly it just becomes part of everyday life, and it becomes very comfortable.
What was military training like?
Well, for me it was not bad because I was in the medical department. For most, they have to go through what they call BCT, or basic combat training. Basic. The Marines call it boot camp. The Army doesn't. But so basic combat training is basically you learn how to be physically fit, how to actually shoot your weapon, how to clean your weapon, how to give first aid, battlefield first aid to people, and also understand what we call basic Army doctrine. That is, what is it that we do there? How do we do our job? So it's much rougher for those folks than it was for me in the medical department.
What is your view now on war after you have been in it, after you've been a physician in?
Well, I think, one of the things that, unfortunately, we've had for thousands of years, we've had wars, and they're horrible. There's no other word for it. I'm not saying there isn't a justifiable war, but there's no good war. They're all bad. Young people die in war, and civilians die in war. So it's a very, very bad thing. There's a thing called the Powell Doctrine, and basically what he tried to land, this is Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State, but he was a 4-star general, and he tried to give us some guidelines so that we did a better job deciding to enter into combat if we did go into combat, making sure we had a military mission, not a political mission, and that we had an exit strategy. When we follow those, we make the best of a bad situation. Unfortunately, the military doesn't make most of those decisions. Those are made by civilian authority, because the military is subject to civilian authority in our country. Not all countries, but it is in our country. So we have to answer to Congress and the President, specifically the President. He's our commander-in-chief. So they can make some decisions that put us in a very difficult situation.
Why did you move back to Cape Cod?
As I said earlier, my wife's family came up here when they were young, and my family came up here when we were young. After moving around, our children didn't have a hometown. But every year but one, when we were in the Army, we would come back to Cape Cod in the summer. And that was their anchor. That's what they thought of as their home. And so, and to this day, we just had Thanksgiving and Christmas, and the kids come home, and from Texas, and one was formerly in Maryland, just moved up here, and now is a teacher at Barnstable Intermediate School. And then we have a couple of kids in Connecticut. But this was the closest we could come to a home for them.
Did you have any unforgettable memories?
Well, not in the sense of, like in combat, you have these horrible things that occur. But there are unforgivable moments with working with wonderful people. When I look back at my career, I think the two words that I think of is I was privileged and how grateful I am. That's the way I still feel.
What age did you retire?
55.
Why did you agree to do this interview?
Well, I think to some extent I want to let people know more about what the military is. It's a very honorable profession. It's people really sacrificing things that many other people really don't appreciate. Not me. I was very lucky. I didn't have to sacrifice much. My family sacrificed a lot. But there are some young people now that are going in the military that sacrifice so much, and I don't think most people appreciate it. I think they just take it for granted, and they just want to share in a non-offensive way how wonderful these people are and how grateful we should be.
If you could go back and do it again, what branch would you enlist in?
That's funny. I always wanted to be a Navy pilot. That was my goal. And being drafted, that sort of blocked that from happening. Knowing what I know now, I'd go back through the Army again, because it was such a wonderful experience. And from a medical standpoint, it has the most ideal medical services of the branches that I'm familiar with.
What were your the happiest times that you've had?
Well, I think just having my family with me when we were moving around, that provided such happiness. It really is so important. I always used to say to everyone, because when we'd be talking about taking vacations, what we call leave, or getting in or getting out of it, I said, remember, family is number one, and it really is. And with your family being taken care of, and the military takes care of your family very well, you feel much more capable of being able to do your job in the military.
So, sorry. If you would redo it, is there anything that you'd regret doing of what you did before? Is there anything that you regret doing?
Well, that's a tough question, because one of the ways I look at it is I sort of say to myself, am I happy where I am? And I'm very happy. I had a wonderful life. I had wonderful opportunities. I had the best training, literally the best training in the world. To be sent to Johns Hopkins, it was number one in the nation and considered number one in the world at the time when we were there. And I'm so happy where I am. I wouldn't want to change anything because I want to be I want to be here where I am, enjoying this and looking back on a wonderful career. I always say, you always want to have something to look backward to with pride and forward to with hope. And I think when you have a career like this, it gives you the perspective where you have both.
Thank you for doing this interview with us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.